He moved into an abandoned farm, but what he found inside was not emptiness. It was a secret that would cost him his life to keep. In the blistering heat of Texas territory, July 1889, a lone rider named Ethan Cole pushed his weary horse across the endless Rio Verde Valley. He was a man running from ghosts, carrying nothing but a battered saddlebag and the heavy weight of his past. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for silence, for a place where his mistakes could finally be buried and forgotten. As the sun bled out across the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, he saw it. A broken-down farm, crooked against the sky like a forgotten skeleton. Its fences were shattered. Its barn leaned like a drunkard, one strong wind away from collapsing into a pile of splinters. Dust devils danced in the hot wind, and every shadow seemed to whisper of lives long gone. This was it. This was the end of the line. Ethan swung himself off his horse, his boots sinking into the dry, cracked earth. For a single, fleeting moment, he believed this broken land might offer him the peace he craved. A place to disappear. A place to be no one. But he was wrong. Just as his hand touched the creaking, sun-bleached wood of the farmhouse door, he froze. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Because from inside the silent, dead ruins came a sound that should not have been there. It was the faint, unmistakable sound of laughter. The laughter was thin and haunting, a ghost of a sound that seemed to pull Ethan deeper into the hollow silence of the broken-down house. It made no sense. This place was a tomb, not a home. He pushed the warped door open, and the dim, dusty light of the dying day spilled across a sight he could never have expected in a million years. It wasn't dust and cobwebs. It wasn't rats and decay. Instead, 3 women stood before him. Their eyes were sharp, their stances were unshaken, and their beauty was a shocking, vibrant thing against the ruin that surrounded them. For a long moment, Ethan couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He just stared, taking in the raw strength they carried, the way they looked at him not with fear, but with a fierce, protective fire, as if he had trespassed on sacred ground. Before he could find his voice, the tallest of them, a woman with a cascade of dark hair falling over her shoulders, raised a hand. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice low and firm. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a warning that felt heavier than the suffocating Texas heat. This farm is no place for strangers. Every instinct screamed at Ethan to turn around, to get back on his horse and ride until the sun came up. But he couldn't. His feet felt nailed to the floor. He was a moth drawn to a flame, mesmerized by the mystery of them. Why would anyone choose to live in such desolation? Who were these women, bound together by something unspoken, their faces etched with stories they clearly had no intention of sharing? He tried to explain. Tried to tell them he meant no harm, that he was just looking for a place to rest his head. But the second woman, one with eyes the color of ice on a winter lake, cut him off. "The land is dangerous," she hissed, her words sharp enough to cut. "You need to go, now, before it's too late." A chill snaked down his spine, colder than her eyes. Danger was no stranger to Ethan Cole. He'd lived with it his whole life. But the way she said it was different. This wasn't the random danger of the frontier. This was something specific, something personal, something buried deep in the soil of this very farm. The youngest of the 3 stood silent, her gaze never wavering. A quiet, shimmering strength radiated from her, as if she carried secrets far too heavy for her years. The weight of their combined presence pressed down on him, thick and suffocating like the air before a lightning storm. Every second stretched into an eternity. Yet Ethan couldn't pull away. He had seen grief before. He knew its shape, its shadow, and he recognized it now in the guarded set of their shoulders, in the flinty hardness of their eyes. These were women who had been forged in the fires of loss, women who had carved their resilience from pure, unadulterated pain. They wanted him gone. but a part of him felt chained to their mystery, anchored to the impossible sound of their laughter that had echoed through walls that should have been lifeless. "What danger?" he asked, his voice rough. His question was met with a deep, profound silence. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. Finally, the eldest one, the one with the dark hair, whispered, and her words were the sound of cracking glass. "This farm was not abandoned by chance," she said, a tremor in her tone. "Men with cruel hearts claimed it with violence. And those men, they haven't disappeared." She paused, her eyes locking onto his. "Their shadow still crawls across this valley, and they are waiting for the right time to return." The tremor in her voice told him this was no ghost story, no campfire tale. This was a truth sharpened by blood and bone. As the last of the sun dipped below the broken windows, the weight of the evening pressed down. Every creak of the old wood sounded like footsteps. Every shift of the wind sounded like a whisper. Ethan understood then. He hadn't just stepped into a shelter. He had stepped into the middle of a war, a story of survival, of danger, of loss, and maybe, just maybe, a chance for redemption. But only if he dared to stay. Only if he dared to ignore every instinct that was screaming at him to ride away and never look back. Ethan's eyes scanned the broken-down farmhouse, the shattered remnants of a life that once was. The air was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of memory. The uneasy silence stretched, pulled taut between him and the three women. He needed air. Without a word, he turned and stepped back outside into the fading glow of twilight. His boots crunched over the dry, thirsty soil. He walked past the house, his gaze drawn to the leaning barn. The wood was old, weathered by 100 seasons, but it was scarred with something else. Dark circles, like angry eyes, pocked the planks. Jagged holes torn clean through the wood. He ran a hand over the rough surface and realized with a jolt what they were. They weren't marks of age. They were bullet holes. Each one was an echo of a savage violence that had once ripped through the air on this very spot. He could almost hear the phantom cracks of gunfire, the screams, the chaos. He felt the cold shadow of a battle long past, a battle that had written its brutal story into the very bones of this place. His chest grew heavy, a knot of ice forming in his gut. He followed a faint path beyond the barn, where the land dipped into a small, secluded clearing. And there, in the brittle yellow grass, he saw them. A handful of rough wooden crosses, weather-beaten and leaning, their surfaces bleached by the relentless sun. They were nameless, anonymous, yet each one carried the crushing weight of memory. The women had followed him out. They stood a few feet behind him, their silence more powerful than any words could be. Finally, the eldest spoke, her voice trembling but strong, like a bell that had been cracked but still knew how to ring. "This was our home," she said softly. "Our father's dream. He carved this farm from the wilderness with his own 2 hands." Her voice filled with a painful warmth. "The dream grew with every season. We were happy." She paused, the warmth draining away, replaced by a chilling emptiness. "Until they came. Strangers with guns and greed in their eyes. They tore it all away." She gestured to the nameless graves. "They left these behind and forced us to cling to the ruins." As she spoke, the second woman's eyes, the ones like chips of ice, hardened with a cold, burning fire. Her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. "They didn't just steal the land," she spat, her voice laced with venom. "They came back, again and again. They wanted to break us, to make sure we never forgot who was in charge." She looked at Ethan, her gaze sharp and challenging. "They left scars that will never fade." Then the youngest, the one who had been so quiet before, finally whispered, her voice barely more than a rustle of dry leaves. "The laughter you heard," she said, her eyes cast down towards the graves. "It wasn't joy. It
It was defiance. It's the only weapon we have left, the only thing they can't take from us. We laugh so they know we're still here, so they know we haven't broken. Ethan felt those words like a physical blow. He knew the sound of loss all too well. He had carried its weight across every dusty mile of his journey. But here it was, standing right in front of him, embodied in three women who had been to hell and back, and still refused to bow. They were shattered, yes, but they were not broken. For a long, agonizing moment, he wrestled with himself. The pull of his old life, the instinct to run, was a powerful current trying to drag him away. It would be so easy to walk away, to leave them to their burden, to let the ghosts of this farm remain theirs and theirs alone. But his heart, the part of him he thought had died long ago, told him something different. It told him that he hadn't stumbled upon this place by accident. Fate, or whatever you want to call it, had dragged him here not to rest, but to make a choice. As the evening darkened into a deep, starless night, the valley seemed to close in around him. Every whisper of the wind carried the same chilling message. The outlaws had not vanished.
They were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to reclaim what they had stolen. Ethan stood there, torn between the instinct for self-preservation and a burgeoning, dangerous sense of resolve. He could get on his horse, ride away under the cover of darkness, and never look back. Or he could stay. He could stay and help them fight for the land that was soaked in their family's blood. It was a choice that would bind him to their danger, to their pain. But maybe, just maybe, it would also bind him to a chance at redemption. He looked at the women. Their eyes watched him, filled with a fragile mixture of hope and sorrow. He felt the weight of the past pressing down on the present, demanding an answer. An answer that would decide not only their fate, but his own. Ethan's silence hung heavy in the air, a tangible thing. The weight of their story, of their sorrow, settled into his bones, and just as he was about to speak, to give them his answer, something changed. A low, deep tremor ran through the ground beneath his feet. It was faint at first, a distant rhythm, but it was growing stronger. The sound of dozens of hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth. The women froze, their faces turning to masks of pale stone, as if the earth itself had just whispered a terrible warning directly into their souls. Ethan whipped his head towards the horizon. There, cutting through the last fading light of dusk, he saw them. A line of riders, their silhouettes sharp and menacing against the burning sky. He didn't need to be told who they were. The wolves were returning to the fold. The shadows were coming home. And in that single, heart-stopping instant, Ethan's choice was made for him. Or maybe it had been made long ago. Instead of turning to his horse, instead of thinking about escape, he turned to the women. "I'm staying," he said, his voice quiet, but as firm and unshakable as a mountain. "We stand together. We face this storm together." Fear flickered in their eyes. Of course it did. But something else was there too. A fierce, defiant spark. The kind of spark that is born only in the hearts of those who have suffered too much, lost too much, to ever surrender again. Hope, sharp and dangerous. The riders drew closer, an approaching thunderhead of violence. The four of them moved with a desperate, frantic energy, turning the broken farm into a makeshift fortress. They didn't have much time. They gathered what little they had, preparing for the inevitable clash. Ethan, a man who knew the grim calculus of a gunfight, showed them how to brace the rifles against their shoulders, how to line up a sight with a steady breath, how to make every single shot count. In turn, they showed him the secrets of the land. The hidden corners of the property where shadows could swallow a man whole. The weak points in the fences that could be used to trap horses. The ways the land itself could be turned into a weapon. The youngest woman's hands shook as she loaded cartridges into a rifle, but her jaw was set with a grim resolve. The eldest whispered a prayer under her breath, not for mercy, but for the strength to deliver justice. The farm transformed around them. Every broken wall, every leaning post became a piece of their defense. The sound of a hammer striking wood, of metal scraping against metal, echoed in the dying light like a frantic heartbeat, growing faster and faster. The sun finally sank below the horizon, painting the clouds in apocalyptic shades of red and gold. The riders reached the edge of the valley and pulled their horses to a halt, a dark wave ready to crash upon the shore. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a cruel set to his mouth, raised his voice. It carried across the field, laced with an arrogance sharpened by cruelty. "Leave the farm!" he bellowed. "Leave now, or we burn it to the ground with you in it." For a breath, the silence that followed was absolute, threatening to swallow them all. Then Ethan stepped forward, his own rifle held steady in his hands. He took a deep breath and shouted back, his voice ringing out clear and defiant in the twilight air. "This farm is no longer yours to claim!" His blood thundered in his ears, but his voice was steady. The women stood at his side, 3 resolute shadows against the dying light, their faces unflinching, their weapons ready. The tension in the air cracked like lightning. The riders fanned out, their movements full of menace, circling the farm like predators sizing up their prey. The air grew thick with dust and the metallic taste of threat. Ethan tightened his grip on his rifle, every sense screaming, every nerve alive with the knowledge that one wrong move, one flinch, would unleash hell. But behind the fear, a strange, unexpected calm settled over him. It was the calm of a man who had been running his entire life and had, against all odds, finally found something worth defending. As the last glow of the sun bled away into the deep black of night, the standoff became unbearable. The promise of violence hung heavy in the air, a physical weight. Every heartbeat in the farmhouse seemed to keep time with the coming storm. The silence didn't just break, it shattered. A single shot rang out, and the valley erupted in a symphony of fire and chaos. Bullets ripped through the dusty air. Screams echoed under the bleeding, starless sky. Horses reared in panic, their terrified whinnies mixing with the shouts of men. Ethan and the women fought shoulder to shoulder, a desperate, unbroken line against the tide of violence. Every heartbeat was a frantic gamble against death. Fear was a living thing, clawing at their throats, but they pushed it down, pressing forward with an unshaken, ferocious resolve. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. Men fell. The battle raged, a whirlwind of motion and noise in the suffocating darkness. Finally, after an eternity of brutal close-quarters fighting, the last of the outlaws turned and fled into the shadows, a wounded animal scurrying back to its hole. The farm stood scarred and battered, but it was not broken. It was still standing. When the smoke cleared, Ethan lowered his rifle, his hands trembling with adrenaline. His breath came in ragged, burning gasps, but his spirit was fierce and unyielding. The women stood beside him, their faces smudged with dirt and gunpowder, their bodies weary, but their eyes blazed with a triumphant light. They were no longer just strangers bound by circumstance. They were kin, forged together in the crucible of blood and fire. As the night fell quiet, a fragile peace settling over the valley, they welcomed him, not as a drifter, not as a stranger, but as one of their own. The scars of the past still whispered on the wind, a constant reminder that peace was a fragile, precious thing, and that tomorrow was never certain. But for this one moment, in the heart of the ruins, hope was alive again. The weeks that followed the battle were a strange mix of quiet rebuilding and simmering tension. By day, they worked to mend the broken farm. Ethan, with his calloused hands and quiet strength, repaired the shattered fences. He reinforced the barn, his hammer blows echoing a steady, reassuring rhythm across the valley. The women worked alongside him. Alara, the eldest, managed their dwindling supplies with a fierce efficiency. Maeve, the one with the icy eyes, patrolled the perimeter, her rifle never far from her reach. And Cora, the youngest, tended to a small, hidden garden, coaxing life from the dry, unforgiving soil. A fragile sense of normalcy began to take root. They shared meals together, their conversations slowly moving from the stark necessities of survival to the small, forgotten details of their lives. Ethan learned their father's name was Joseph, a man who had seen a paradise in this harsh land. He learned their mother, Maria, had died years before the outlaws came, leaving a hole in their lives that had never truly healed. But the peace was a thin veneer stretched over a deep well of fear. Every night, the memory of the attack returned. Every creak of the floorboards, every howl of the wind, sounded like the return of Silas Kane and his men. They had won the battle, but everyone knew the war was far from over. Kane was not a man who would accept defeat. He would be back. And when he came, he would bring more men, more guns, more fury. One evening, as they sat around a small fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their weary faces, Alara looked at Ethan, her expression serious. "He'll be back for more than just the land, Ethan," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You need to know what you're truly fighting for." Ethan waited, the crackling of the fire the only sound. "Our father," Alara continued, "he wasn't just a farmer. Before he came here, he was a prospector. He spent years in the mountains, searching." She took a deep breath, as if the words themselves were heavy. "He found it. A vein of gold so rich it would make a man a king." Maeve scoffed, poking the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the night air. "A king or a corpse? It's a curse, that gold. It's what brought Kane here in the first place. Our father told the wrong person in town, bragged after too many whiskeys. The word spread like a plague. He never told us where it was," Cora added, her voice small. "He said he drew a map, but he hid it. He said the knowledge was too dangerous. He was right. So that was it, the secret buried beneath the soil. It wasn't just about a piece of land. It was about a fortune that had already cost them their father and could very well cost them their lives." The bullet holes, the graves, the constant fear, it all snapped into a sharper, more terrifying focus. Ethan felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This was bigger than he could have imagined. Kane wasn't just a greedy outlaw. He was a man hunting a treasure, and he would tear this valley apart, stone by stone, to find it. A few nights later, Maeve found him sitting on the porch, staring out into the impenetrable darkness. She stood beside him, her arms crossed, her silence a challenge. "You could still leave," she said, not unkindly. "No one would blame you. This isn't your fight." "I told you I was staying," Ethan replied, his voice low. "Why?" she pressed, her icy eyes searching his face. "Why would a man like you, a man who looks like he's been running his whole life, suddenly decide to stop here and fight for a lost cause?" Ethan was silent for a long time, the ghosts of his past swirling around him in the darkness. He had never spoken of it to anyone. The words were rust, lodged deep in his throat. But looking at Maeve, at her fierce, broken strength, he felt a crack in the wall he had built around his heart. "I wasn't always a drifter," he began, his voice raspy. "I had a wife, a daughter, a small ranch, not so different from this one." He stared out into the night, but he wasn't seeing the valley. He was seeing a memory, a scene burned into his mind forever. "A gang came through, not unlike Kane's. They wanted water, supplies. I tried to reason with them. I thought I could handle it." His voice broke, a raw, ragged sound. "I was wrong. They burned it all. The house, the barn, everything." He squeezed his eyes shut, but he couldn't block out the image of the flames, the sound of the screams. "I wasn't fast enough. I wasn't strong enough. I survived. They didn't." He finally looked at Maeve, the shame and grief of a lifetime raw in his eyes. "I've been running ever since. Running from the man I was that day. The man who couldn't protect his family." He took a shaky breath. "When I saw you three, When I heard your story, I saw a second chance. A chance to do it right this time. A chance to stand and fight instead of run. Maeve was silent, the ice in her eyes melting just a fraction, replaced by a flicker of understanding, of shared pain. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of his burden. In that moment, a new bond was forged between them, deeper than the one made in the heat of battle. It was a bond of broken souls, finding a reason to mend. But their shared moment of peace was shattered by a sound from the distance. A single, lonely gunshot, echoing through the night. The shot reverberated through the valley, a sharp crack that shattered the fragile peace of the night. Instantly they were all on their feet, the quiet conversation on the porch forgotten. Ethan grabbed his rifle, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Maeve was already moving, her eyes scanning the darkness with a predator's intensity. Alara and Cora rushed out of the house, their faces pale in the moonlight. It came from the ridge, Maeve said, her voice a low growl. To the east. A signal? Alara whispered, her hand clutching a small pistol. Or a warning, Ethan replied grimly. Kane's letting us know he's out there, watching, playing with us. The shot was a deliberate act of psychological warfare. It was a promise, a reminder that they were living on borrowed time. The days that followed were filled with a suffocating, nerve-shredding tension. They slept in shifts, never leaving the farm unguarded. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching footsteps. The valley, which had once seemed like a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. One afternoon, while reinforcing a section of the fence line far from the house, Cora let out a sharp cry. Ethan and Maeve were at her side in an instant, weapons drawn. But there was no outlaw, no immediate threat. Cora was pointing at the ground, at a place where the earth had been disturbed near the base of an old, gnarled oak tree. I was digging for roots, she explained, her voice trembling. The ground felt hollow. Ethan knelt, his eyes narrowed. He pushed away the loose dirt and stones. Beneath a few inches of soil, his fingers brushed against something hard and flat. Wood. Working together, they cleared the area, revealing the edges of a small, hidden cellar door, its existence completely masked by the overgrown landscape. It was old, the wood warped and covered in moss. With a grunt of effort, Ethan and Maeve managed to pry the heavy door open. A wave of cool, musty air washed over them. A dark, narrow set of stone steps led down into the blackness. Father never told us about this, Alara said, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder as she joined them. Lighting a lantern, Ethan led the way down into the earth. The cellar was small, not much bigger than a closet, the air thick with the smell of damp soil and thyme. It was empty, save for a single, small, iron-bound chest sitting in the center of the dirt floor. It was locked. There was no key. Stand back, Ethan said, his jaw set. He raised the butt of his rifle and, with a powerful swing, brought it down hard on the rusted lock. The lock groaned in protest but didn't break. He struck it again, and again, the sound booming in the enclosed space. On the fourth strike, the metal shrieked and snapped. The chest was open. They crowded around, peering inside with bated breath. But it wasn't filled with gold coins or glittering jewels. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were 3 items. A thick, leather-bound journal. A rolled-up piece of parchment, yellowed with age. And a single, beautifully crafted Colt revolver, its silver plating gleaming in the lantern light. Alara reached in and carefully lifted out the journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it to the first page. The handwriting was her father's. It's his, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The parchment, when unrolled, was not a map to the gold. It was a deed. A legal, ironclad deed to the Rio Verde Valley, from the river to the mountains, signed and stamped by the territorial governor. Their father hadn't just owned the farm, he had owned everything. This is what Cain is really after, Ethan said, the pieces clicking into place. The gold is the lure, but this is the prize. With this deed, he controls the entire valley. The water, the land, everything. The weight of the discovery was staggering. Their fight wasn't just for a farm and a hidden treasure. It was for the future of the entire region. But it was the journal that held the most shocking revelation. Alara began to read aloud, her voice shaking as she deciphered her father's cramped script. He wrote of his discovery of the gold, of his fears about its power to corrupt. He wrote of buying the deed to the valley, hoping to create a community, a legacy for his daughters. And then he wrote about Silas Cain. Cain hadn't been a stranger who just happened upon the farm. He had been their father's partner. The lantern light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on their stunned faces. Joseph's journal told a story of betrayal. He and Cain had been partners in the mountains, prospecting together. They had found the gold vein together. They had made a pact to share it, to build a future. But Cain's greed had been a poison. He had wanted it all. He tried to kill me in the mountains, Alara read, her voice a choked whisper. Left me for dead. I managed to escape, to make my way here and buy the deed before he could. I thought I had beaten him. I thought my family was safe. The journal detailed how Joseph, fearing Cain would eventually find him, had turned the farm into a hidden fortress. He had built the cellar. He had stockpiled weapons. He had even, in the final chilling entry, written about the gold itself. The main vein is too deep, too dangerous to mine alone, Ilara read, her eyes wide with disbelief. So I brought a fraction of it here. A taste. Enough to prove the claim exists. I buried it, but I also set a trap. If Cain ever comes for it, the very ground he stands on will be his tomb. He had rigged the small cave where he'd hidden the starter cache of gold with dynamite. The journal contained a crude drawing, a map not to the treasure, but to the trigger. A single support beam in the old abandoned mine shaft at the far end of their property. A single well-placed rifle shot would bring the entire thing down. The laughter, the defiance. It hadn't just been a weapon of the spirit. Their father had given them a real one. A weapon of earth and fire. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the silence. It wasn't a gunshot this time. It was a shout, from outside, followed by another. It was Maeve's voice, sharp with alarm. Riders! They're coming! A lot of them! They scrambled out of the cellar, emerging into the harsh sunlight, their eyes blinking as they adjusted. Maeve was on the roof of the barn, pointing to the east. A cloud of dust was rising from the horizon, a massive, swirling column that signaled the approach of a small army. This wasn't a scouting party. This wasn't a threat. This was the final act. Silas Cain was coming to finish what he had started. He was coming to claim his valley, and to bury the last people who knew the truth of his betrayal. But now they had a truth of their own, and a trap. The dust cloud grew, a rolling, angry thunderhead on the horizon. There was no more time for talk, no more time for planning. The war had arrived. Cora, get to the mine shaft, Ethan commanded, his voice sharp and clear, cutting through the rising panic. Take the rifle with the scope. You know the drawing. You know the target. Do not fire until I give the signal, not 1 second before. Cora nodded, her young face pale but set with a grim determination. She took the rifle, a look of profound, terrifying responsibility in her eyes, and sprinted towards the rocky outcrop where the abandoned mine was hidden. Alara, Maeve, the house, Ethan continued, his mind racing, calculating angles and fields of fire. Barricade the windows. Aim for the horses first. A man on foot is a slower target. The two sisters didn't hesitate. They ran for the farmhouse, their movements economical and practiced. They had been preparing for this day their entire lives. Ethan grabbed 2 rifles and a bag of ammunition and climbed to the hayloft of the barn. It gave him a clear, elevated view of the open field in front of the farm. He could see the riders clearly now. There were at least 20 of them, led by a large man on a black horse. Silas Kane. Even from this distance, the man radiated an aura of brutal authority. The riders fanned out, forming a wide, menacing arc as they approached. They were confident, arrogant. They saw a broken-down farm and 3 women. They didn't know about the man in the barn. They didn't know about the girl on the ridge with a high-powered rifle, and they certainly didn't know about the trap waiting for them under the earth. Kane pulled his horse to a halt just out of rifle range. "Joseph!" he bellowed, his voice a gravelly roar that echoed across the valley. "I know you're in there, you old coward! I've come for what's mine. Send out your girls and I might just let you live." The silence from the farm was his only answer. "Have it your way," Kane snarled. He raised his hand and then dropped it, the signal to attack. The riders spurred their horses forward, letting out wild, savage yells, their guns blazing. The air was instantly filled with the roar of gunfire and the whiz of bullets splintering the wood of the barn and the house. Ethan waited. He breathed slowly, evenly, just as he had taught the sisters to do. He ignored the chaos, the bullets thudding into the walls around him. He waited for the riders to get closer, to bunch up as they charged towards the house. Now. "Fire!" he roared, though no one but him could hear it. He sighted on the lead rider and squeezed the trigger. The man flew from his saddle. From the house, 2 more shots rang out, and 2 more horses went down, their riders tumbling to the hard ground. The charge faltered, the outlaws' arrogant confidence shattered by the unexpected, coordinated resistance. They scrambled for cover, using their downed horses and the few rocks in the field. The wild charge had turned into a siege. The gunfight raged. The air grew thick with the acrid stench of gunpowder. Ethan fired with a calm, deadly efficiency, his shots methodical and precise. He was no longer the running man, the broken farmer. He was a soldier, a protector, fighting with a clarity and purpose he hadn't felt in years. From the house, Alara and Maeve kept up a steady stream of fire, their shots forcing the outlaws to keep their heads down. But there were too many of them. Slowly, methodically, Kane's men began to advance, moving from cover to cover, their bullets chewing away at the farm's meager defenses. Ethan saw Kane directing his men, pointing towards the rocky outcrop where the mine was, where Cora was hiding. He realized with a sickening lurch what Kane was thinking. The outlaw didn't know about the dynamite, but he suspected the gold was in the old mine. He was sending a group of his men to secure it. No, Ethan breathed. He had to give the signal. It was now or never. He took aim at the bell that hung from a post in the center of the yard, the one used to call workers in from the fields. He took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and fired. The bullet struck the bell with a loud, clear clang that cut through the cacophony of the battle. It was the signal. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Ethan's blood ran cold. Had something happened to Cora? Was she all right? And then, the world exploded. A deafening, ground-shaking roar erupted from the ridge. The earth bucked and heaved. A massive plume of rock, dirt, and smoke shot hundreds of feet into the air as the entire entrance to the mine collapsed in on itself. The shockwave hit the valley like a physical blow, staggering men and horses alike. The outlaws who had been advancing on the mine were simply gone, swallowed by the earth. For a moment, everyone, Ethan, the sisters, Kane's remaining men, was stunned into silence, their ears ringing from the blast. The battlefield was shrouded in a thick, choking cloud of dust. Silas Kane stared at the smoking crater where the mine used to be, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. His treasure was gone, buried under 1,000 tons of rock. "Kill them!" he screamed, his voice raw with fury. "Kill them all!" Spurred by their leader's rage, The remaining outlaws renewed their attack with a desperate ferocity. They no longer cared about cover. They charged forward, a wave of pure, murderous intent. Ethan knew this was the final push. They were out of tricks, out of traps. It would come down to bullets and blood. He fired, reloaded, fired again, his shoulder aching from the recoil, his barrel hot to the touch. A bullet ripped through the wall next to his head, showering his face with splinters. He saw two of Kane's men break from the main group, racing towards the barn. Towards him. He shot one, but the other kept coming, disappearing from view as he reached the ground floor. Ethan's blood ran cold. He was trapped in the hayloft with an enemy below. He could hear the man moving, knocking things over. He grabbed the loaded Colt revolver from his belt, his father-in-law's gun, the last thing he had from his old life. He holstered his rifle and waited, his heart pounding a frantic drum solo against his ribs. The creak of the ladder told him the man was coming up. Ethan flattened himself against the wall, his pistol raised, his breathing shallow. The outlaw's head and shoulders appeared over the edge of the loft floor. He was young, his face wild with battle lust. His eyes met Ethan's for a split second. Ethan fired. The outlaw fell backward without a sound. But the momentary distraction had cost them. Looking back out the window, Ethan saw the unthinkable. Silas Kane and two of his men had reached the house. He heard the splintering crash of the front door being kicked in, followed by a scream from Alara. A cold, primal fear seized him, fiercer than anything he had felt for his own life. Without a second thought, he launched himself from the hayloft window, hitting the ground in a painful roll, the impact jarring every bone in his body. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the searing pain in his shoulder, and sprinted for the house. He burst through the shattered doorway into a scene of chaos. One outlaw lay dead on the floor, a victim of Maeve's deadly aim, but the other had her pinned against the wall, her rifle just out of reach. Alara was struggling against the massive form of Silas Kane, who held her in a brutal bear hug, a long-bladed knife pressed against her throat. "It's over," Kane snarled, his eyes locking on Ethan. His face was a mask of sweat, dirt, and pure hatred. "The gold is gone. The deed is mine. Drop your gun, or she dies." Ethan froze, his pistol aimed squarely at Kane's chest. Maeve's captor pressed his own gun to her temple. It was a stalemate, a deadly tableau. "I should have killed your father in the mountains," Kane spat, his knuckles white as he tightened his grip. "He was always weak, just like you." He looked at Alara, a cruel smile twisting his lips, and just like his daughters. Something snapped inside Ethan. The years of running, of grief, of self-hatred coalesced into a single point of cold, hard rage. He was not going to let history repeat itself. He was not going to be the man who failed to protect his family. Not again. "Let her go, Kane," Ethan said, his voice dangerously quiet. Kane just laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You're in no position to make demands." Suddenly, a movement from the corner of the room caught everyone's attention. Cora. She had slipped in through the back during the chaos, her face streaked with tears and dirt, but her eyes were blazing. In her hands, she held the silver-plated Colt revolver from her father's chest. The third weapon. The outlaw holding Maeve glanced at Cora for a fraction of a second, dismissing the young girl as a threat. It was the last mistake he ever made. In that instant of distraction, Maeve slammed her head back, smashing it into the man's nose with a sickening crunch of bone. He staggered back, howling in pain, and Maeve lunged for her rifle. At the same moment, Ethan did the one thing Kane didn't expect. He didn't fire at Kane. He fired at the floor right in front of him. The shot was deafening in the small room. The bullet ricocheted off the hard wooden planks, sending splinters flying. It was a diversion, a split second of chaos, and it was all he needed. As Kane flinched from the unexpected shot, Alara drove her elbow back hard into his ribs. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a precious instant. It was enough. Alara tore herself free, stumbling away from him. Now it was just Ethan and Kane. Kane roared with rage and charged, firing his pistol wildly. Ethan dove behind an overturned table as bullets chewed through the wood. He came up firing his own revolver. A bullet grazed Kane's arm. Another tore through his leg. The big man bellowed in pain and fury, but kept coming, his sheer size and momentum carrying him forward. He crashed into the table, sending it and Ethan flying. The pistol was knocked from Ethan's hand, skittering across the floor. Kane loomed over him, the knife raised, his eyes burning with murderous intent. Ethan scrambled backward, his hand searching desperately for a weapon. His fingers closed around something hard and heavy on the hearth, an iron poker. He brought it up just in time to block the downward slash of Kane's knife, the clang of metal on metal ringing in his ears. They wrestled on the floor, a desperate grunting struggle of strength and will. Kane was bigger, stronger, fueled by years of greed and rage. But Ethan was fighting for more than his own life. He was fighting for redemption. He was fighting for his family. With a final desperate surge of strength, Ethan twisted the poker, trapping Kane's knife hand. He drove his knee into Kane's wounded leg. The outlaw screamed as the bone gave way. Ethan pushed, using all his leverage, and rolled them over, gaining the upper hand. He pressed the hot end of the poker against Kane's neck. "It's over, Silas," Ethan gasped, his voice ragged. Kane stared up at him, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain, shock, and hatred. He opened his mouth to curse, to threaten, to plead. He never got the chance. A single sharp report echoed through the room. Kane's eyes went blank, a small, dark hole appearing in the center of his forehead. His massive body went limp, collapsing on top of Ethan. Shaking, Ethan pushed the dead weight off him and looked up. Cora stood there, the silver revolver still smoking in her small, steady hands. Her face was a mask of grim resolve. The quietest of the sisters had fired the final shot. Silence descended upon the room, broken only by their ragged, panting breaths. It was done. The fighting was over. The valley was theirs. The sun rose the next morning on a scene of devastation. The farm was scarred by bullets, the ground littered with the refuse of battle. But it was also quiet. For the first time in years, the valley was truly at peace. They buried the dead, friend and foe alike, in the small clearing with the other nameless crosses. There were no words spoken. There was nothing left to say. In the weeks and months that followed, they began to rebuild. Not just the farm, but their lives. They repaired the house, mended the fences, and planted new crops. The work was hard, but it was honest, and with every nail driven, with every seed planted, they were not just building a home. They were healing. The deed to the valley was filed in the nearest town. The land was officially theirs, secured not just by a piece of paper, but by blood, sweat, and sacrifice. The legend of the Rio Verde gold faded, dismissed as a tall tale that had cost a band of outlaws their lives. The valley's true treasure, its peace, its freedom, was safe. Ethan Cole never left. The man who had come to the valley seeking silence and an ending had found something else entirely. He had found a voice. He had found a family. He had found a beginning. The ghosts of his past no longer chased him. He had faced them down in a dusty farmhouse, and in doing so, had finally found his redemption. He stood on the porch one evening, watching the sun set, the same way he had on the day he arrived. But everything was different. The farm was no longer broken. It was strong. Alara came and stood beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. Maeve was in the barn, tending to the horses, her movements no longer sharp with suspicion, but steady with purpose. And Cora was in her garden, humming a soft tune, coaxing life from the earth. This was home. A home forged in fire, built on a foundation of loss, but a home nonetheless. A place where 4 broken people had come together and made something whole. What do you think? Is it possible for a place of great sorrow to become a place of even greater hope? If you enjoyed this story, Don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of survival, justice, and the untamed spirit of the Wild West.